Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name's Brendan Cole. The energy giant BP is holding a worldwide moment of silence for the victims of last week's hostage crisis at an Algerian gas plant. It comes as both families and governments around the world await answers from the Algerian authorities over its storming of the In Amenas facility in the Sahara Desert, which was seized by Islamist militants. The tragedy is the outcome of a larger series of events that cannot be separated from its transnational and especially regional context. How do Al-Quaeda and other Jihadi Islamist movements and the Algerian militant Mokhtar Belmokhtar, who claimed responsibility for the siege, figure in the context of the region? Everyone had their eye on Afghanistan and Pakistan. Attention is now drawn to Islamist movements across Africa, from the Al-Shabaab militia in Somalia to Boko Haram in northern Nigeria. Is this a re-emergence of the war on terror? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Dr. Berny Sèbe. He's a lecturer in colonial and post-colonial studies at the University of Birmingham. Also in the studio is Nick Butler. He's a former BP executive and now professor and chair of the King's Policy Institute at King's College London. Also joining me in the studio is Dr. Gita Subrahmanyam, who's a North Africa expert at the London School of Economics. And on the line we have Françoise Wasservogel, Secretary General of the International Agency for the North of Mali. A warm welcome to you all. Nick, I'll start with you. Oil companies would be very aware of this kind of risk. If it was such a big risk, why didn't they see this coming?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the companies, having spent the last few days worrying about the people who were caught out there and those who've died and their families, are now moving on to analyse the situation. Both BP and Statoil, who are the main companies in Algeria, believe that the country had moved to something rather better than it had been in the 1990s when there was a long and bloody civil war. They were able to operate quite easily and to work with the local community. And then suddenly this comes out of nowhere. I don't think anyone in the companies expected a coordinated, well-planned attack of this sort. And they are now beginning to wonder whether this is the start of a more serious campaign against the authorities in Algeria and against international investment.
Clearly, Algeria is lucrative, as is the region, for companies like BP and Statoil. They're not going to give up there without a fight, though, will they?
They don't like to fight, and they don't like to lose staff and put others in danger. I think they will be looking very carefully at the balance of risk and reward of being in Algeria if this is more than an isolated incident. I mean, this is clearly not just a bunch of bandits trying to extract some rent by kidnapping people. It's a very organised political attack, part of the disintegration of order across the region, which has spread into a country which these companies believed was under government control. That now requires a reconsideration of everything they're doing.
Berny Sèbe, I'll turn to you. It's clearly a very organised attack, and I guess as far as the militants are concerned, a very successful one. But there was a banditry aspect to it. I mean, were they seeking money? That they've been very successful in getting millions of dollars through hostage-taking. I mean, how did this fit into their overall scheme?
It was actually a very different operation this time, because as has just been mentioned by Nick, contrary to earlier instances when actually negotiation was possible. In the case of the recent operation in Turin, they actually had very clear political aims, and which was in particular the immediate end to the French-backed intervention in Mali, organized by the Malian government in retaliation and as a way of resisting against the attack, which was orchestrated by the various Islamist groups operating in northern Mali and trying to seize power in Bamako. This time, actually, the negotiation was much more difficult because it was not about money, but it was really about geostrategical and geopolitical decisions made in the region. And it was a way of trying to retaliate against the Algerian government's willingness to contribute to the French war effort in the region by opening its airspace to fighter jets on their way to Mali. And I'd like to stress that what is really revealing and what is really exceptional in this case is that for the first time it was really the oil industry of Algeria which was struck, because even in the worst moments of the dirty war, of the so-called dirty war of Algeria in the 1990s, usually the installations of the oil industry were spared. They were not attacked. So the fightings took place elsewhere, but not where the money of the Algerian government was made.
You brought up the idea of the dirty war fought in the 90s. That, Gita Subrahmanyam, did that inform the Algerian response? Because it seemed that David Cameron was a bit piqued that he wasn't consulted, or that the British government wasn't consulted at the Algerian response. But here you have a very highly trained Algerian military that have emotional scars from a very violent, turbulent 1990s, it was perfectly natural that they wanted to send out a strong message to militants in their own country, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the Algerian government has always maintained an idea of non-negotiation, non-recognition, eradication of any threat in the country. And they seem to have followed that. They also generally try and strike as early as possible. In their view, any sort of event like this that carries out and is drawn out over time becomes more dangerous and more difficult to contain. So early containment is one of their goals.
Do you think that's something that the West particularly appreciated, this non-negotiation type stance?
I don't know if we can say that quite fairly. I think what we can say is different governments were split on how they would deal with the situation. The US maintained that they were on the stance of non-negotiation. Some of the other governments might have preferred to negotiate with the groups and try and get their people out, because that would have been their main goal. And I think this is the problem, is there were very many nationalities involved here.
I think what will worry the companies is not so much the Algerian resistance to negotiating, but their refusal to allow the very special forces that different countries have in dealing with these situations to come in and help them. They were determined to do it themselves, and they didn't do it very well. An awful lot of people were killed as a result of the way in which they did it. And I think that will worry people who are investors in Algeria.
I understand that from the perspective of the oil companies operating in the area, this might be a cause for concern. But I'd like to stress as well that the Algerian government has been dealing over 2 decades with events sharing lots of similarities. And we can easily understand that also, given the historical background against which this type of events unfold, it is perfectly understandable that the Algerian government wants to defend its sovereignty. It's a bit different from other countries in the area, for instance, like Mali, which obviously have demonstrated that they found it much more difficult to confront the problems which they faced. Whereas in Algeria, the Algerian government wants to show complete mastery of the situation.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing the hostage crisis last week in Algeria and its aftermath. Joining me is Dr. Berny Sèbe, who's a lecturer in colonial and post-colonial studies at the University of Birmingham. Nick Butler, a former BP executive and now professor and chair of the King's Policy Institute at King's College London. Dr. Gita Subrahmanyam, who's a North Africa expert at the London School of Economics. And on the line, Françoise Wasservogel, who's Secretary-General of the International Agency for the North of Mali. Gita Subrahmanyam, that's a fair point, isn't it, that given the French experience in Algeria, and Algeria wants to be seen to be standing on its own feet, to be solving its own problems?
Yeah, but I mean, we have to go beyond the French period to the 1990s, because that's really when the Algerian government was fighting Islamist groups. Before that you had pockets of resistance, but they weren't sort of tied to Islamism. So Algeria has been fighting for its sovereignty on its own land, in a sense, for a very long time. There's a real link between counterterrorism and state legitimacy in that country and generally in that region, because they're one of the stronger and more stable countries in a region that is characterized by a lot of weak and fragile states. And the number of weak and fragile states has increased post-Arab Spring.
And of course, the background to this is obviously the intervention in Mali. And I'd like to bring in Françoise Wasservogel, who's the Secretary-General of the International Agency for the North of Mali. Did it surprise you, Françoise, the speed with which the militants took over the plant in Algeria, given that only several days before the French intervened in Mali?
Well, I was not expecting this at all. We were not expecting this at all. But what I have to say is that the relationships between Algeria and Mali are very special because they are sister countries. And it comes back to the colonial time and the decolonization period, because they have helped each other. And the Malian people were really expecting Algeria to help them. You're talking about the militants, which is something that is some sort of surprising for me, because I do not see them as militants but as gangsters, because one of your guests was talking about the geostrategic role there and the power of the region because, and I agree absolutely, because what we have to remember is that in this Sahel area, I mean, for years and years, I would say 20 or 30 years, those traffickers have been working, making money, and not only them, all right, the government also, because, for example, the Malian government knew it and was sort of drawing benefits from it. It's not a surprise that those people came. And I'm not going to say that the intervention is good or not good, what I hear, because we're in permanent contact with the Malian people in the north as well as in Bamako, and they are greeting the intervention with absolute happiness, joy, because they know that otherwise those groups would have reached Bamako.
Can I just bring in Gita Subrahmanyam, the point there that the people of Mali welcome this intervention, but there hasn't been a clear political objective stated by the French, and perhaps the French are getting involved in something that might be quite difficult for them to get out of.
Well, I think any Western country that gets involved in the region is running risk of destabilizing the region. I mean, if we think back to before this incident, even the Algerian government was pursuing a policy that's often pursued in that region of non-intervention in neighbouring countries' affairs. And they were against both the NATO involvement in Libya and French involvement in Mali. And it's only recently that they've opened up the airways for the French to get in. But I'm not saying this is directly related to what's happened recently, but I would say that getting involved in any sort of sense in that region also poses a problem in terms of trying to extricate oneself and being very clear on what the goals are.
Given the colonial history, Berny Sèbe, do you think that the goals have been stated categorically by the French? There was the French foreign minister referred to a reconquest of Mali. Is that quite a provocative term, or is that a mistranslation perhaps?
So what he meant actually was reconquering the north of Mali so that the unity of the country would be brought back, because the northern Mali has been de facto separated from the rest of the country around the area of Douentza. So in the bottleneck section of the territories, there was a de facto division since the spring of 2012 between the northern half of Mali, which was actually under control of the Islamist militias, and the south, which was still under the control of the Republic of Mali. What I'd like to stress, however, is the fact that most of the time, and maybe this was a problem of colonial guilt, the French were not fully prepared to intervene, because for most of the time what they wanted to do was for African countries allied to Mali's, and especially the community of West African countries, to take leadership in the reaction to the Islamist militias operating in northern Mali. However, the agenda has been set by the Islamist militias, which decided at some point to break the status quo, which had prevailed since the spring of 2012, and by deciding actually to attack Malian forces and tried to have a go at Bamako itself so that they could seize the whole country and make the African-led intervention completely actually useless, because it would have arrived in September otherwise. Then they took the initiative and they actually changed the whole game. But initially, the idea was not for France to be heavily committed, because President Hollande is fully aware of the country's colonial past and was not willing to play a leading role. So it was in the absence of any other major contributor to the war effort, in order to help the Malian government, that the French had to step in, because they were actually among the very few ones who could operate in the area very effectively, at least to stop the Islamist progress towards Bamako.
What I find most intriguing is that this attack, which was clearly very well organised, was planned well before the French went anywhere near Mali. If the stories that we've seen in the last few days, that the attack involved getting people inside the plant, Algerians on side, and giving information to the people making the attack, that would have taken weeks, months. This was not an accidental emotional reaction to the fact that the Algerians had opened their airspace to French jets. This is much more concerted, and therefore it should be analysed in those terms, with the question being, what will the people who organised that attack do next?
I'd like to touch on the ideology of Mokhtar Belmokhtar, who he said he's not an offshoot of Al-Quaeda, but he's part of the full movement. Gita Subrahmanyam, what do you think of that? He's known for opportunism, I suppose. He's a successful smuggler and whatnot. I mean, how ideologically and religiously driven is he, do you think?
I think, of course, he's going to have some rhetoric about his religious role and other sorts of things. I think he simply is looking for power in a place where there's been a power vacuum created. I've said previously that I think he's trying to establish himself as the new Osama bin Laden, and I do believe that in a sense that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to show himself as the new leader who can unify all the disparate splinter groups in the area.
Berny Sèbe, is that possible to unify that? I mean, is there a kind of narrative that can coalesce these kinds of groups? Because presumably, if it's a power struggle and he's exploiting a vacuum, does that have the strength to last?
Yes, there is a real intention on his part, of course, to claim leadership of the Jihadi movement in the area, in particular because he's been in rather bad terms, it seems, having had a bad relationship, in particular with Drogdel, who's the head of Al-Quaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. There are reports, according to which he was actually expelled from Al-Quaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. So there are lots of cells which are trying to outdo each other. And this is something which might actually be quite detrimental on the short term, because they might want to organize more spectacular events or hostage takings in the next few months or years. But it's true that on the long term, it seems very difficult to allow all these groups to coalesce, because there are lots also of battles of egos. And it would be a great mistake to imagine that there is a homogeneous jihadi movement operating in the area.
Gita Subrahmanyam, I mean, what do we know about the communication between militants, say, we're talking about AQIM, this big, wide, nebulous network that nobody can particularly define, but we've also got the Al-Shabaab militia on the east coast of Africa. We've got Boko Haram on the west coast of Africa. I mean, do we know anything about the coordination and the communication between these networks?
We don't have that much information about, in specific, how they communicate and do things. We know that there are pieces of evidence that seem to show that they've been working together, or at least communicating with one another. The fact that, for example, we had some French hostages taken from one place and then brought to another country and then killed there. We can say that there's definitely some kind of transnational movement. The other thing I want to add to what Bernie said before is there's a real danger here at the moment in this sort of competitive power struggle between the groups there that has shifted the way that hostages are treated, in a sense, with this particular attack. Before, where you had hostages taken, most times they weren't killed. They were exchanged for ransom. Here, it seems to be a different affair, and this is the big worry, that people are in more danger now in the hostage crises in future in this region than they were before.
Nick Butler, just quickly about the negotiations or lack thereof. I mean, how much desire was there for them to simply make money out of this?
From what we can see, very little. They could have made money by handling this in a very different way. And I think the point on the competitive nature of this is important, because now those who are responsible will have seen that the way to get an enormous amount of publicity and fame across the world is to do something like this, a real spectacular. And that sets a precedent in this a very competitive environment between different groups.
Can I just quickly return to Mali and Françoise Wasservogel? Can Mali be stabilised with the French presence there? I mean, are we going to see, or are we going to have to look towards more of an African solution?
I must say that the Malian people are really disappointed because of the slowness of the intervention from the other African countries, and they do not understand it, actually. It sounds like a lack of financial means. Stabilization of Mali, we, the International Agency for the North of Mali, are very worried about what France will do after the intervention, because the president said that he was going to help Mali to restructure. We would like people not to forget that if Mali is where it is today, it's because of the collapse of the state, the collapse of the whole system, because of corruption and nepotism, which means that if France wants to help Mali afterwards, it will be in the control of general audit of Mali, which could show that the whole thing is due to corruption.
Would not any kind of stabilisation require France acting as some kind of conduit, I suppose, for discussion negotiations between the Tuaregs in the north and the government in Bamako?
But you're talking about Tuaregs, but I mean the MNLA, the separatist movement, actually first does not represent the whole Tuareg population. That's for sure. There are a very, very small percentage of the Tuareg population first, and second, I mean in Mali in general, and second, they represent very few people in the northern regions, all right? They are less than 2%, I guess, all right? Which means they cannot talk for the different ethnies, let's say, in the north of Mali. So it means that all those groups, because there are a lot of groups, the MNLA is separatist, and all the others are pretending that they're working for a religion, all right? Which is not the religion the Malian people practice. What you have to know is that the International Agency for the North of Mali, actually, we are working with the official forces, the official Malian forces, all right? We are working for the moment, right now. I mean, since the attack of Kona, which means about 2 weeks ago now, we have been working daily with the official forces, and these official forces have asked us to organize indirect contacts between Bamako and those assailants, all right? And we officially ask the Muslim countries to help us organize those indirect contacts. I'm not talking about negotiations. I'm talking about organizing a table, thanks to the Muslim countries, to organize discussions to create indirect contact between Bamako and the armed groups. And it is very important. These are not negotiations. Right?
Is there confidence that kind of contact can work?
Indirect contact, because of
indirect
course,
contact.
behind those groups, you have more forces. We're not talking about contact with the local people, because if those people say something, who is going to talk behind, all right? So it means that for the moment, the official Malian forces we're working with are demanding the Muslim countries who feel concerned with the attack of another Muslim country to contact us, for example, because they want to sit around the table with those countries.
Yes, I just wanted to react to this in particular by stressing that even the MNLA has actually welcomed the arrival of French air jets in order to stop the attacks of Ansar-Din, Mujao, and Al-Quaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. So even them, who've been claiming that they want and who've proclaimed the independence of northern Mali, are actually revising their position. We have to remember that they were actually expelled from most of northern Mali, and so they're in the very extreme northern tip of the territory at the moment, and actually they have found it extremely difficult to resist the Islamist fundamentalist groups operating in the area. So although they triggered the whole problem in northern Mali, which has been ongoing since the 1960s, they're now actually adopting a new position which is much more compatible with what the main government in Mali wants to achieve, in particular because they've given up the idea of full independence and are now ready to consider the principle of a federation. So they still want greater autonomy, but they no longer want full independence. What I'd just like to state very briefly is I think that it's very important to really think beyond the current military operations and consider carefully what the international community and what the Malian government wants to achieve in the area, in particular by trying to solve once and for all the Tuareg question, which has been really developing and brewing since the 1960s, but also to think about returning to democracy, offering real opportunities to all the populations of northern Mali to be fully integrated into the nation to which they belong, and also making sure this means starting very quickly by making sure that the Malian army and its allies are not involved in any indiscriminate retaliation against light-skinned populations in northern Mali if and when the northern territories are reconquered by the regulars of the Malian army.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. We're discussing the hostage crisis in Algeria and its aftermath with Dr. Berny Sèbe, Nick Butler, Dr. Gita Subrahmanyam and Françoise Wasservogel. Regarding the Tuareg question, Gita, are we seeing a kind of unintended consequence of the overthrow of Gaddafi, Tuaregs armed with artillery and arms from that Libya campaign?
Yeah, well, we understand that there was a large movement of weapons from Gaddafi's arsenal that was brought to Mali by the returning soldiers, and that this is one of the things that makes that northern region particularly dangerous, not only for different groups within Mali, but different groups from outside Mali that are traveling through the region. As with any sort of militant groups, the larger their arsenal, the greater the threat.
Nick Butler, Cameron was actually a bit vague when he referred to unspecified surveillance aircraft and helping with intelligence and counter-terrorism assets. Can we read from that he's upped his level of rhetoric, but actually the British commitment will remain as it is?
Well, there are obvious limits to the British capability to act in the region, including a very limited knowledge of what is going on there. We don't have the history. I think that what he is saying, and I think it's right, is that this is a long-term, a major problem. My worry would be that the French, having gone in very quickly, will find it much more difficult to come out again. And the danger will be that they become entrenched, they have to stay, and they become a focal point for all these groups who won't like, for all the reasons we've heard, a colonial power returning to Africa.
That's one of the main reasons why François Hollande did everything that was in his power to avoid intervening. But once again, really, the intervention was forced upon the Malian government, which then asked for help from the French government. So it's actually not the French coming in and in a scenario similar to that of Iraq, for instance, which really looked like an invasion. In this case, it's actually a call coming from the Malian government, which is not fully democratic, obviously, because there was a coup. However, what we need to stress is that the current president is the president of the National Assembly. So he still has an electoral mandate, but he still has enough legitimacy, and he's also recognized now by our West African colleagues. And it was actually a decision which was very clear. It was either leaving the Islamists reach Bamako and let the Republic of Mali crumble and therefore be replaced by the Caliphate and the projects of the Islamists, or try to do something and halt their progression. Unfortunately, the situation was such that there was no alternative.
Gita Subrahmanyam, I suppose the narrative here for the West is the threat to the West and the potential of launching attacks on the West, but is that a fair assessment, or would we really be seeing the battleground moving to other unstable regions of Africa potentially?
We can't read into the future. I would say that it's easier to reach targets closer to where you're based, but we know that the funding sources of some of these groups include diaspora groups in Western countries. And this is where we begin to worry about how far things can spread. The news that the mastermind of this operation was from Canada, this is point of concern.
Nick Butler, there is obviously the news this morning that a Canadian, a Westerner, potentially involved. This is a cause for concern, isn't it?
It shows the nature and the scale of what was organised last week. I think the spectacular nature of that event and the response to it could encourage people to look for other similar big targets. And that could be in Algeria, but it could also be in other unstable countries like Nigeria.
Well, sadly, we've run out of time. I'd just like to finish by thanking all my guests. Nick Butler, former BP executive and now Professor and Chair of King's Policy Institute at King's College London. Dr. Berny Sèbe, lecturer in colonial and post-colonial studies at the University of Birmingham. Dr. Gita Subrahmanyam, who's a North Africa expert at the London School of Economics. And on the line from Paris, Françoise Wasservogel, who's the Secretary General of the International Agency for the North of Mali. Thank you very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.